How can we fit more people into our cities without compromising livability? Or perhaps another way to phrase that question is what needs to change to make our cities livable for all citizens as our populations grow in an environment where we have a chronic shortage of dwellings and increasing homelessness? How do we approach a crisis when those not directly impacted by that crisis realise the enormity of it? Does this remind anybody of the climate crisis? How do we exit the age of NIMBY-ism and bring on the YIMBYs? And what the hell is a YIMBY, I hear you say? Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
Today we're discussing the future of our cities through a Sydney lens. Our guest is Eamon Waterford, the CEO of the urban policy think tank called the Committee for Sydney. And Eamon started his career working side by side with people experiencing long-term homelessness in Penrith and Blacktown to understand their challenges, and undertook the first homelessness street count in the Western Parkland city. And then fast forward to not too long ago, as the Committee for Sydney's policy director, he delivered more than 40 reports, including work on density done well, benchmarking Sydney's performance, and the Sandstone mega region, which we'll love to find out about that, and safety after dark. The reason we're talking to Eamon today is he's a self-confessed YIMBY. So he's obviously interested in the future of Sydney, but he is a yes in my backyard adherent. And we're keen to understand more about why and what that means. So welcome, Eamon. This is going to be a juicy chat and we're really looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Eamon, I read there an article in the SMH. It was back in April, and it was really interesting. I think back then, there was a real conversation around rental stress, housing affordability, and prices are starting to increase, etc. But the conversation's gone in overdrive, right, around this housing. What's it really mean for our city? What is this? And one of your key points in that article, it was like the headline was "The housing crisis is our next COVID," and it kind of has this feel to it at the moment. It's going back here, probably 2016, 2017. I remember it was is Sydney where I want to be long term? Everyone's getting disenfranchised out of the city again. And, before we sort of go into a big detailed conversation around that, what's the sort of Committee of Sydney and, what's your role? What do you guys do? What's the plan, I guess?
Yeah, so we're an urban policy think tank. So we're looking at what the big challenges facing greater metropolitan Sydney are and how we can fix those problems. We are funded by members, mostly that's big corporates and institutions from across the city. So we've got developers as members, we've got architecture firms, we've got universities, we've got local councils, we've got community housing providers, we've got tech firms, we've got banks, we've got fintech sectors, companies from the fintech sector. It's a real mixed bag, but basically it represents the diversity of this great city. So we look at a lot of different issues facing Sydney. Obviously, housing is kind of the existential crisis we're facing now, but we talk about kind of 6 topics that we care about. They are planning and housing, transport and infrastructure, arts and culture and livability, climate and resilience, the future of the economy, and then equity and fairness. And obviously that comes, full circle back to that housing question. But basically, how do we make sure this is a city that keeps working for everybody and isn't just for, the haves and not the have-nots? So we are pretty lucky in that we get to have a job that lets us talk about almost anything that is facing Sydney, because they all fit into one of those buckets, basically. But we advocate to government, we talk to the community, we want to be, helping have a proper public policy discussion about these issues.
What I like about that, because all of those 6 areas, I think, relate to housing in one way or another, even arts, and you're looking at sort of lifestyle. Well, when you're looking from a property lens, what makes an area desirable to live in, it's not just, so I can commute to work easily. It's actually, what do I do when I'm not working? And that's a lot of that is arts and lifestyle. You know, what are the amenities you get in an area? Like, that's just one example from the 6 that you said there. Obviously, the economy is important to housing as well, and the how far you are away from where you work, and how flourishing the area is, and then there's safety that's tied into it. I mean, all of those 6 things are so intrinsically tied in with our housing. Or housing is intrinsically tied in with all those 6 areas. One, you could sort of chicken and the egg in a way. And I think, you know, Sydney's a great city. We live in Sydney, you know, don't want to talk Sydney down, but at the same time, a lot of people who live in Sydney and enjoy, you know, maybe that coastal side of the city, perhaps, you know, that get maybe a bit more of their fair share of amenity compared to others in the city. There is that sort of idea of protectionist sort of attitude, and you know, we don't want to host the hordes that are going to come into this city in our area, or maybe we can't. Maybe there's not enough space. We really literally don't have enough space. So what are some of the high level topics or high level discussions that are being had around what needs to change? And do people, is this really a zero sum game? Do people have to lose so that other people can live and enjoy living in this city?
Well, the first thing to say in this space is let's dispel the myth that density is bad or that we don't enjoy dense places. You know, if you ask anybody, and I encourage you to, you know, when you're at a barbecue on a Saturday, ask people if they could live anywhere, where would they live, in Sydney or in any city really? 100%, you know, 100 times out of 100, people will pick somewhere that's pretty dense. It's full of people, because that's life, you know, it's vibrant, it's happening. You know, people don't want quiet, dull, boring suburban experiences. They want rich, cultural, complex, nighttime, daytime experiences. And you need a lot of people to have those experiences. So, you know, we actually all intrinsically like being around other people. That's kind of human nature. And density is the way that we achieve that in urban environments. So when people say they don't like density, really what they're talking about is kind of all of the negative, you know, side effects of density. And yeah, we need to address those and recognize that those are challenges. But we need to start this discussion from saying, well, hang on a minute, you know, density is not a dirty word. It's a really good word. It actually means livability. It means lifestyle. It means amenity. It means opportunity. It means, you know, fairness when it's done well. And so then the debate shifts from do we want density or no density to, well, if we're going to have density, how do we do density well rather than density that's crap? And, you know, there's plenty of examples of crap density, right? Like we can all point to places that you look at and you say, geez, I wouldn't want to live there. But also, you know, no one's walking around Potts Point being like, oh, it's too dense around here. I don't like how dense Potts Point is. No one's walking around Surrey Hills and saying, oh, I'd love it if it was a little bit less dense. Like they're saying, oh, there's action, there's vibrancy, there's open space, there's cafes, there's restaurants, there's people, it's fun. So we need to really start from that kind of inflection point of saying, like, actually, we're talking about the quality of density rather than the fundamental quantum of density.
Eamon, I guess what's the issue with, you know, us just walking into, you know, just going a business as usual, right? Like if Sydney doesn't, you know, make change, right, doesn't solve these issues, like where's it gone wrong in the past where cities have been a bit complacent, a little bit arrogant and said, look, everyone's just going to move to our city because we're the best in the world at whatever it is, but they haven't done infrastructure planning. They haven't done great planning around housing, and they've almost created this problem where people don't want to move to the city, and then the economy suffers, and it goes from one of the top cities to, is this sort of like not trying to put a doomsday scenario on it, but this is something where a social pressure of not solving these issues basically starts to, you know, our livability starts to really drop.
Yeah. Oh, look, I'll put a doomsday scenario on it, and I'll use a really good example for this, right? We talk about San Francisco. We talk about, you know, Silicon Valley is like the home of the startup. It was for a period of time the place to be if you were a new company, if you were a startup. You Google, you were Apple, you wanted to be in Silicon Valley. Nobody wants to be there anymore. There are fewer startups happening in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, than in places like Austin, Texas, or Seattle, or Vancouver, because it's too expensive in San Francisco. You know, they only built 4,000, 6,000 homes a year at a time when we were building like 40 or 50,000 homes a year, a bit less than that, but, you know, like 1/10 of the housing we were building. And we would hear these stories, right, of like cleaners who had to get on a bus and spend 3 hours on a bus to go in and clean Google's headquarters. And we think, geez, what a terrible American experience. But that is the reality of where Sydney is in its trajectory if we just kick along with business as usual. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but we already do have cleaners who are spending, 3-4 hours a day commuting. It's not a stretch to think, okay, if we priced cleaners out of the Sydney basin, they would be living in Newcastle, and all of a sudden that's a 5-hour commute every day. And the reality is the city stops functioning very well if you don't have cleaners, or you end up paying cleaners an enormous amount of money to make it worth their while. Neither is particularly productive, neither is particularly fair. It's certainly kind of a bit morally bankrupt, and it's definitely economically stupid. So it's a big issue that we're facing, and we're sort of we're rolling straight into that.
Do you think that's like a lot around that attraction for talent, right? Like, if you want to start a startup, one, it's about getting, workers that are in that place, but also you need to attract talent around the world because there's a skill shortage, right? So do you think that's where Australia might go, well, we're moving away from this manufacturing, service-based economy. We need all these new startups and these new businesses. But ultimately, when they start to pitch around the world, people say, hey, I'm not going to leave, Singapore because I've got lower tax rates. I can still get housing. There's great employment opportunity, but I can't get any of that in Australia because I can't find a house and it's too expensive. And is this like a 5 years time where we basically stifle innovation, A, because house prices are too expensive and no one starts a business anyway, and then B, no one can get talent because housing's too expensive.
Exactly. So this challenge that Sydney has always suffered from, because Sydney's always been an expensive city, right? Wages are high, house prices have always been pretty high, but we've been on this sort of balancing act where price is here, high cost, but attractiveness is up here. Sydney is a beautiful city. It is a fun city. And look, it wasn't very fun for a little while, but it's fun again. It's, a vibrant city. It's a diverse city. It's a safe city. There's a lot to love about Sydney. So that equation's always been worth it, right? And that bit in between these 2 points, that's the talent attraction, differential. Prices are going up. Attractiveness isn't keeping pace at the moment, right? So all of a sudden we're getting to a point where we'll hit a tipping point and it's not going to be worth it. Now, Singapore, yes, you can make a lot more money in Singapore right now than if you live in Sydney. House prices, well, you can't buy a house if you're not a local, but you can rent for a relatively decent price. Yes, tax rates are low. Singapore's not as fun as Sydney, but at a certain point, fun won't be worth it for the cost, right? And the risk is that's the differential that we're going to hit. And so once you hit that tipping point, your reputation gets trashed and it becomes really hard to come back from that. And we see that with other expensive cities around the world where they sort of become, homes of like wealthy, and they lose that grittiness, they lose that edginess. And that's actually what is attracting talent, is a little bit of culture, a little bit of vibrancy, a little bit of danger, just a little bit of danger. You lose all of that. And then people are like, look, you're Vienna, you're boring, sure, beautiful galleries. I'm sure like very austere buildings, but I don't want to live in Vienna. Like I want to live somewhere cool and fun.
Is that the issue with that, the lockout laws and the killing of our nightlife, like how short-sightedness that was? And even, I guess if you talk about Melbourne, like, how extreme the lockdowns were and, how that reputation went around the world, like that really took the edge off the coolness of these cities and, how hard it's to get it back once you've lost it.
Yeah, like we really rely on our reputation because we're at the other end of a really long international flight from most of the world, right? Like we can't just rely on people stumbling across us like Barcelona can. And we can't just rely on, intrastate travel like America can. People have to be pretty intentional about coming to Australia because it's a long way away. Although we're getting closer because obviously, Asian century, increasingly we are actually in the right time zone, but we're still a long way away even from North Asia, right? So that reputation runs a long way before people actually have a lived experience of this city. And so, the lockout laws sucked. They weren't great. And they definitely damaged our reputation. Now, there was still fun to be had in Sydney, but because it became this all-consuming kind of reputational shift that Sydney was boring, it had, an outsized impact on our brand, on our reputation. And Melbourne's had the same. Look, WA's had the same, right? With the lockdowns, that they had over COVID. You hear now people, it's interesting, I was chatting to my counterpart in Perth and she was saying, we try and attract talent from the East Coast and people say to us, we don't want to move to Perth because we don't want to get stuck there. And the reality is like, yeah, you probably get back, but that's like that reputational fear exists long after all the lockouts have finished, right? So it is actually like we've got to really foster and be considerate of our reputation on the international stage, because being an attractive city, and I don't just mean attractive like good looking, I mean attractive like we attract things. We're a magnet for talent, for money, for people, for ideas. That's the only way Sydney is ever successful.
So we have a housing crisis across the country, and we started talking about this, we started noticing this, I should say, in 2020, and it was a shortage of rental stock, and that was driven by a lot of expats returning home, taking up their homes that they had previously rented out, and it's sort of this little trickle knock-on effect. People needing more rooms because they're working from home, all that sort of stuff. So now we're 3 years down the track, and what started as oh God, it's really hard to find a rental everywhere has become, oh my God, we're a million houses short from what we need. We need short-term, responses here. This, the federal government's legislation that's stalled at the moment. Maybe it may not be stalled by the time we go to air, but they're trying to create a future fund and all this sort of palaver. All this stuff is not short-term. It's not going to have an immediate impact, right? In Sydney, we've starting. I watched last night a Q&A, so you can date this. We're recording this early June. There was an episode that was filmed in Newcastle, and they talked about in Newcastle, there's people living in cars, families living in cars. We've talked about this on this podcast before, that this is in certain regional areas, this sort of thing is happening. I understand it's happening in Sydney too now. We are not a third world country, right? But yet we have situations in this country where both parents could have a job, and we've got families with kids not having a house, not having a place to call home. This is not good for society. And so we've got some serious issues here, and this has to be addressed, promptly. But then that's not, if you're thinking about the future of a city, you got to think of the knock-on effect of how do we immediately create homes or housing? Then long term, what are the things that we need to do? And I know that there are, there was an article in the Herald only last week about, I think it was Mossman and Wallara Council saying that, we're full, we don't have any more land. And I get that too. I mean, in established areas where they're already dense, there's not much give and not much extra space potentially. But then you've got shopping strips with retail stores sitting vacant. So these are places with roofs and walls and presumably plumbing. So what are some of the things that can be done, do you think, short term, but also some of the more, I guess, structural changes that we need in terms of our thinking, to move away from that NIMBY-ism into YIMBY-ism? What are some solutions that can really turn the dial?
Yeah. Cool. This is the $10 billion question, right? So let me. I
know. I love asking easy ones.
Yeah. Let me take a couple of chunks of that, right? Let's start with the long-term stuff, because the long-term one is actually the easiest to answer, which is we need a lot more houses. Like at a very basic level, we've got probably 150,000 fewer homes than we need. And we need those built and more because the population is growing. So we've got to build like maybe double the number of houses a year that we've been building in Sydney to this point. And we've got to start now, and we probably don't stop for a really, really long time, like decades. So we've got to have a step change that starts now.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but this is all in an environment where we've been having declining approvals and commencements. Right. So we're going in the wrong direction here, right?
Yeah. Oh, we're absolutely, and costs are rising. We've got global supply chain challenges, which mean not only is it harder to get an approval because the planning system is very slow in New South Wales. Once you get that approval, it costs more to build, and timelines blow out as a result of cost blowouts and talent shortages and all of these things. So it's, if you were starting from somewhere, you wouldn't start from here, but here we are. This is the situation that we're in. So we've got to do quite a lot. It's not just double the amount of effort, because we've been picking the low hanging fruit to get the 32, 35, 40,000 homes a year. The next 40 are going to be much harder. The next 30, whatever. It's going to be harder. So it's actually not a redoubling of effort. It's a re-quadrupling of effort to achieve that long-term supply. So that's the long-term game, is we've got to build a lot more. Now, I would argue that not only do we have to be building a lot of housing, but we also need to be allocating a portion of that housing directly to low-income families, social and affordable housing. And by that, I mean, like, some of it is social for really vulnerable people. So yes, it is the parents, single parents with kids who are otherwise going to be exposed to homelessness. Some of it is sort of low to middle income families. Like, basically at the moment, the market in Sydney is so rough that, nurses, teachers, cops, cleaners can't afford to live in this city. We probably need to be actually designating and allocating affordable housing for key workers to ensure that we never lose the chance to do this. A really good example of what happens when this doesn't get done is there's an aged care facility on the Northern Beaches that recently got closed because they couldn't get staff to go and work in that facility. Now, there are aged people on the Northern Beaches. There are just nobody who can afford to be an aged care worker and live on the beaches. So, I don't think supply alone will solve for that problem. You actually probably need to be thinking, all right, when we build a retirement home, we also need to build housing next door to it that is for the people who will work in that retirement home or similar. So that's like the long-term game is just like hard, but obvious. We got to build a lot. Heaps of it everywhere.
So when you were talking about the aged care home, and I do recall that, and I'm thinking, my God, that's just insane, isn't it? Mining towns do this really well. They build dongers for the workers. Do we have to build dongers in aged care facilities? Next to hospitals. Next to schools. Do we have to build dongers? Kent Lardner, who's sort of our resident property geek, he talks about the building of Nissan huts. Do we have to do that? Is that something that we have to address? But anyway, keep going. I think maybe we do.
Well, yeah, we've got to be thinking very clever about the short-term solutions because, like, we're in a very acute experience right now that has been caused by all of this backlog of undersupply, but also obviously interest rates, inflation, global supply chain challenges, COVID, migration. These are big problems that are not going to be solved anytime, certainly not by Sydney alone. So let's just bank them in. We'll say, right, we know the interest rate environment sucks for housing affordability, but it is what it is. We've got to work from that. So that's the big long term. The short term is more complex, but probably a bit easier. There are some things we could be doing. So we can make renting a lot more secure. At the moment, being a renter is not a great experience in Sydney. Like, historically and also globally, Sydney doesn't have great rental ledge when it comes to sort of protections for tenants compared to other jurisdictions around the world. We could make that better. And indeed, the state government has said they want to do some stuff around like no grounds evictions, technical stuff that'll help. So we could make renting, that would be, 30% of the population rent. That'd be like quite an immediate and sort of broad effect to do that. That'd be one piece. We also then could be thinking, really cleverly and tactically about interventions we could make to create homes right now that maybe aren't going to be homes forever. So whether it's Nissan huts, whether it's like conversion of, high street retail or like the apartments above it, whether it's, thinking differently about some of the underutilized commercial real estate that we've got in this city that could potentially, in certain circumstances, be converted into residential, whether it's just looking at sort of lazy assets. Like, there are a lot of, surface sort of like ground plane parking lots in Sydney, right? Typically next to train stations. Let's put parking in that. Let's put 2 levels of parking in that. And then let's put 7 floors of housing on top of it. That is a lazy asset where you can actually be delivering more parking, but also more housing in the same go. So these are, tactical. And like, when we're talking about the scale of need being like tens of thousands of homes, none of these things alone is going to solve for it. But I suspect the short-term solution to some of this stuff is going to be, hundreds of little things like this, all kind of keeping us going for long enough that the supply can start to catch up.
And do you think there's like actually the capacity to build this amount? Like, ultimately, we'd love to double our, capacity of building 40, 50,000 to 100,000 in New South Wales, but has the developers got enough materials? Have they got enough labor? Is there enough capital? Is there enough buyers, to sort of fund all this? Is it, or are we just going to be growing at market demand? And is it so hard to move the needle that far? And are we better, like you say, to look at short term, alongside this to go, well, yeah, maybe we can go from 40 to 60, but that's also optimistic. What we need to be doing is looking at other options, like you say, because it's just unrealistic for us to be able to play catch up this fast.
Right. That's a really good point. And the reality is, if we just stick with the markets we currently have, probably there isn't the demand for the developers to actually dive into this in the scale that we need them to, which is why we need to create new markets, right? So one market would be the government could pay developers to build a bunch of social housing that the government then owns, or a community housing provider, that sort of thing. So there's a whole separate market that actually wouldn't really, yes, it would compete for supplies, for materials and for talent, but it wouldn't compete in terms of price. Build to rent's another really great, promising example, right? Like there is a whole other product with a different market if it's institutional owners renting the product rather than trying to sell it onto the market. Because this is inherently one of the challenges that we've had, is by only having sort of build to sell as the only kind of market going for housing, there is an inherent challenge where for a developer who's paid X amount for the land based on X sales or X plus sales price, if that price starts to drop, there's a real tension for them because they won't get the sales price that actually was banked in when they bought the land in the very first place. And so there's this difficulty they often are set with, which is either maybe we need to postpone this, the sale of this product until we can get that price we asked for. I'm using this a lot to sort of describe my ideas, but this idea of like actually,
if you're watching the video, you'll watch Eamon's hands.
I'm using my hands to just.
We've got a little bit of delay here, but
down. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. So watch the video if you're wondering what he's doing with his hands. It's on YouTube. Sorry to interrupt you there. I mean, the other thing too, we've got situations where builders going broke, right? And I get that doesn't necessarily impact the total labour pool because subbies and employees will get jobs elsewhere. But it does mean that there's less businesses that have the capacity or capability of building as well. So we've got another sort of problem fitting into the system, right?
Yeah, totally. And so I think a good analogy for this would be to look at our infrastructure capacity, like a transport infrastructure capacity that we had in Sydney. 10 years ago, we'd built one train line in a decade. So there was very little, institutional talent or capacity to build a train line, let alone like tunnels and complex road projects and these sorts of things, right? But because the government made it a very clear objective and they said there's going to be this pipeline of work over the next decade, it's $20 billion a year, it's going to be big amounts, but you can invest, you can be confident that you can hire 100 new people because there's going to be enough work for you going forward. That actually it was market creating, right? It actually created the capacity, the talent, the supply chain investments that were required in order to make these sorts of things cost effective for Sydney to do. So a similar approach to housing, I think, is probably what's needed. You need a government to say, we have a commitment to building 60,000, let's say, homes a year for the next 10 years. So if you want to get into the business of helping build 600,000 homes, come to Sydney now, bring your talent in, attract them in because they're going to have a job for a period of time. So that kind of infrastructure footing, rather than treating this like just something that the market will sort of ebb and flow on, is in a sense the way we need to approach this. Because it's like COVID or like climate, right? This is a crisis of a scale where government and the private sector are going to have to work hand in glove to make it happen.
So, Eamon, what's your thoughts on, the hard axe coming down basically and saying, look, ultimately, if we wanted to encourage more build to sell, right, because it's hard to do the build to rent, it's hard to do the social housing on scale. Ultimately, we need buyers to enter the market, right, to be funding this. Is the mum and dad investor or the first home buyer, or the downsizer, or the upgrader, right, who's in an apartment that wants something bigger. But what they really want is, a quality asset, right? And what their currently options are high density in areas where maybe they don't want to live, right? But if you, for example, literally did just smash the axe down on, these areas where we haven't built, lower North Shore, inner west, eastern suburbs, beaches, and you literally just changed zoning and you literally said, look, developers can now build X, Y, Z in these areas. And because they're so desirable, those locations, the developers would go to those locations because the margin's there. They've got a product that's still scarce and they can sell them at premium prices because their buyer pool is quite premium. Do you think that would be enough to create a building boom, which would basically ignite this shortfall and ultimately be great for our city because you'd be creating more housing stock in inner city or inner locations, which are more sustainable, better for, we've already got infrastructure in these locations. So we haven't got to build new trains or planes or whatever it is, right? So it makes sense. But what's the appetite for doing something like that? Are we still another crisis away? Like, are we in 10 years' time? Are they going to go, look, we've the baby boomer generation's all dying out, right? And they've had their flag in the sand, and the Gen Xers are now saying, you know what, it's not fair for my kids because they can't buy, like with climate change, right? We don't see it till it's on our doorstep. So, what's your thoughts?
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Don't forget that you can download our free full or forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
So that's like a big chunk of the answer, right? We did some research on, we would call it stationary development or transit-oriented development. You can get about 50% of the actual amount of housing that Sydney needs within walking distance of train stations, because we've got a pretty good train network. We've got 350 train stations, and a lot of those train stations are really close to jobs. The North, you talked about the North Shore, eastern suburbs, inner west, southwest, the inner southwest. These places are like really close. I live in Torella. It's a 20-minute train ride, I should say, into the city, and it's like single story, low rise, R1 zoned residential. Like, it's criminal that I get away with a 600 square meter block, 2 minutes walk from a train station, 20 minutes from the city. Like, that's not fair that I get that. And actually it would be far better for that to be terraced or probably a couple of stories of apartments for something that proximate. And you would actually end up with a much better experience living in that community. Like, there are no shops in Torella, for example. Like, I wish I had a supermarket. I wish I had a couple of good cafes. I don't have that stuff because there's not enough people living there. And I'd get that if there were more people. So we do need to be putting housing close to where people want to live. And that's like close to connectivity, close to amenity, like open space and cafes and the like, close to high streets. There are lots of locations where we've basically just bottled the debate with the community. We've not done a very good job of actually selling them on the opportunity of densification. And so we've let it be lower rise than it should be. At the same time, like, we've made it someone else's problem, right? Like, if you live on the outskirts of Sydney and, urban sprawl, you got to drive a long way. And that's pretty unsustainable, and it's hot, and it's really carbon intensive. Like, this is we have basically externalized all of the social problems that come with, punting people to the margins of our society. And we all have a bit of a responsibility to bring those people back in.
Eamon, what's your thoughts on this? Like, one of the best things for housing affordability, I thought, which I'm not sure on, I'm still going back the other way a little bit, is this sort of work from home movement, right? Like, because, if you don't need to commute, then you can look at further. You can look further away from the train lines, right? There's better for the environment. There's lots of things, right? But then at Catch-22, if you work from home, you do need more space. So your housing needs are higher, right? You don't just need a bed and a little kitchen. You need somewhere to have a desk. And, especially if you're sharing with people, you might need multiple rooms. So, what's your thoughts on this? Because there's a real pushback to the office, right? And, you can see all the... and so is this something where we need as a city, we need to almost go back to what's best for Sydney is a flexible hybrid, and we should be designing for that world and encouraging companies to go down that way rather than what seems to be happening is get back to the office because that's better for our commercial towers and for our cafes.
But I reckon, sorry, before you answer there, I reckon the hybrid is actually more of a problem because the hybrid means that you need your bigger house and you still need to be close to transport because, you don't really want to do, sure, you might only have to do your commute 2 days a week, but you know what? If you can afford a shorter commute, you're gonna go and push prices up closer to an area where you get easy access to the working hubs and also you get your extra room because you got to work from home the other 3 days in a week. So I actually think that work from home or that hybrid work from home is actually one of the contributors to the problem. But that's my theory.
Yeah. Look, It is. The reality, I suspect, is we're probably never going to get rid of hybrid. Like hybrid is kind of the way forward. There are huge amounts of benefit that we derive from being around other people and the productivity, collaborative kind of outcomes you get from bouncing ideas off people that can only happen in person. So like the office is a thing that's important, but clearly there's a whole bunch of types of work that we do where it's deep thinking, it's like uninterrupted time that are just better from home. So like from a productivity perspective, hybrid is really productive, I suspect. Now, I think there'll be a couple of interesting things we're going to see. We used to, in urban policy, we used to have this thing called the Marchetti constant, which was like a rough estimate of how long people would commute. And we used to say, it was 30 minutes each way a day. That people would basically put up with about an hour's commute a day. And if their commute was longer than that, they reported, much lower levels of like life satisfaction. And if it was lower than that, then they would tend to move further out to get more space to hit that 30-minute mark. I think what actually we were measuring was a 5-hour-a-week Marchetti constant rather than a 1-hour-a-day constant. So what I suspect will happen is if people are coming into the office, say 2 days a week, all of a sudden they might be okay with a 2.5-hour a day commute for those 2 days if their commute on the other 3 days is 0 hours. And actually we might see some reshaping where people will be like, you know what, I don't mind living on the Southern Highlands and commuting a couple of days into the Sydney CBD because I only do it 2 days a week. And actually for the other 3 days, I get to look out on a beautiful vista and I have my space and my sheep or whatever it is that you have in the Southern Highlands.
But that's sort of what we've been experiencing. And that's certainly been sort of our view of how people would rationalize this. But is it working that way? Is it a theory or is it proving to be, the case?
So what I would say is Sydney's more polycentric than other cities around Australia and around the world in that we've got multiple centres like Parramatta, Macquarie Park, Liverpool, whereas like Melbourne's got one and everybody's kind of trying to all shove into the single place. So that helps a little bit with the idea that you can work from home, but then also be commuting into a closer centre every now and then. One data point I would note during COVID, Campos Coffee reported sales basically remained flat the whole time. They said, you know what, we're actually selling as much coffee as we always did. The difference is we're selling less coffee in the Sydney CBD and we're selling more coffee to, suburban and town centre cafes because people are still going out to buy a coffee. They're just buying it from slightly different places. So that, like if the caffeine intake of people stays the same, that suggests that people are working as hard. They're as productive. They're just slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're right. Like, as Melbourne's trying to do that multi, hub model, right? Like, you come into the local shops 1 or 2 days a week for your work. Maybe you go to the city, 1 or 2 times a week. Because I think, maybe that's practically for the environment as well. Like, we've got a housing problem, but what are some of the other issues that even if we solved our housing, Sydney's got other issues that are brewing in the background that are going to catch us out if we don't start making plans around them as well. Maybe it's infrastructure. What are some other issues?
Well, I mean, this is the other $10 billion question, right? Okay. We're very sprawled. We're very low density as a city. We are like the same population as some global cities on about the third, at 3 times the footprint. So we get in our cars way more often than we should. We should be able to walk, cycle, and catch buses and trains much more often than we can. So we've got a big mode share challenge where we've got to shift people out of their cars into other forms of transport. Kids don't walk to school, and not to get sort of back in my day, because obviously it wasn't back in my day. I've only got a kid in year 1, but kids should be able to walk to school and they don't anymore. So mode and transport's a big one. Climate is going to be a big challenge for us. We are beset by beautiful natural, spaces all around our city, but they have a tendency to flood, get on fire, and then, wash into the ocean. So we are beset by almost every type of natural disaster that will get worse as a result of climate change. And so we've got to get more resilient to climate change. We've got to deal with heat better. We've got to deal with flooding better. We've got to deal with, sea level rises better than we do. And then, I think we've got our fun back. My sense is, there was that period during the lockout laws when Sydney was boring. But we just had World Pride at the beginning of this year, and the best party in the world was happening in Sydney during World Pride, right? There was a 2-week period where you wouldn't want to be anywhere else in the world but Sydney. So more to do in that space. 100% we're not there yet, but I would say that's one area where like I'm not as existentially worried.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Pride was so good. It just reminded me of the Olympics, actually. Sydney came to life. And so it shows what we're capable of, but we all have short memories and then we forget and we go back to our sort of bury our heads in the sand and just get on with it and be a bit miserable about other people making noise in our vicinity. So, with this, back to sort of the YIMBY-ism, NIMBY-ism, all that sort of thing, and where to bring people into Sydney as a big city. We also have movement around Sydney is curtailed by our rivers. There's a bridge thing in Sydney. I don't want to live on this side of the bridge or that side of the bridge or whatever. And then you've got roads within that. But we do have some geographical constraints. But one of the councils that is often held up to be, this is the bastion of NIMBY-ism is Mossman. Right. And you look over there and I look at that and I think, I'd probably be the same. The roads over there are choked. Yes, it's a very expensive place to live, when people have lovely homes on big blocks of land, predominantly. There's not a huge amount of apartments compared to other suburbs, so you could argue it's not as dense, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is that they're not well serviced by public transport. They're relying on buses and there's not a lot of, greenfield sites, ready to be redeveloped as apartments or as, medium to high density living. So I get that there's a plan in place that sort of puts certain targets on different councils and all the rest of it. But it's interesting that and Wallara Council, for instance, are obviously, held up as being examples of the worst examples of NIMBY-ism. And sometimes I feel that those accusations are unfair and other times I think they're totally justified. And so I guess, if you're looking at it from a policy or from a bigger picture thing and you're looking at the whole of Sydney, I mean, where should the density go? And look, cleaners need to find somewhere to live too, and baristas and teachers and ambulance drive all the rest of it, right? They need to be able to live amongst us all, right? For our own good as well as theirs. What are some of the, there's big argument that all the buildings should be going out west, and I don't believe that that's necessarily the solution either. From a bigger picture perspective in terms of where we're going to fit in, where is the ideal, how are we going to fit them in? Where are the people going to live? How is it going to be spread? And, from an idealistic point of view, because I'm presuming that you got to come from an idealistic point of view first, right? What's the solution?
Yeah. Okay. There's a few things that I would say. Mossman Council, I think, is a bit NIMBY. You could point to things like them refusing to have a Woolworths in Mossman as an example. Yep. There's, yes. that is just pure NIMBY-ism. It's sort of like we understand that people want to buy food, but not in my backyard. Like, come on. I think we need to step away from sort of being too fixated on like east versus west or buses versus trains and just kind of get back to first principles on some of this stuff. Ideally, you want as many people to be living in places where they have close, proximate access to good things that make a good life. So then if you start from kind of that base, you say, all right, well, what do we mean by good things? Well, we mean jobs, we mean schools, we mean hospitals, we mean doctors' surgeries, shopping centres, these sorts of things. And then what do we mean by close? Well, we mean, the ability for them to probably walk or catch public transport to something within half an hour, let's say 15 minutes, 30 minutes. So if you look at those parameters, you'd say that Mossman actually is one of those places, right? Like, yes, they've only got buses, but the B line will get you into the city within 30 minutes. So that ticks that box. Conversely, Campbelltown doesn't tick that box. If you're trying to get people into the Sydney CBD. Now, Campbelltown's got a lot of amenity in and of itself, so maybe that's your centre rather than the Sydney CBD. But we need to be sort of saying, well, let's all start from a basis of first principles, and then everybody takes, what they can withstand within those reasonable sort of first principles. The other thing that I think it's important to remind people when they say, oh, I don't want this sort of stuff in my local community is you're pricing out your kids. You're pricing out your grandkids. You're pricing out the people who will look after you if you end up in an aged care facility. You're pricing out baristas. You're pricing out cleaners. You're pricing out artists and cultural people and bartenders. And actually, you probably want all of those things because they're what make a good life. When we talk about being proximate to things that make for a good life, they do include bars and cafes and, clean streets. So, like, we also need to recognize that sometimes in trying to lock in, plexiglass, or sort of say like, no, we're full, well, let's lock this off. What you're actually doing is locking yourself off from the experience of a good life.
Yeah, I agree. 100% agree. You won't get an argument from here, but it's just that, the conversation, you talked before about governments, it needs to be collaborative, governments, community, housing providers, developers, all the players in this need to collaborate, but the governments are the only ones worried about getting re-elected. Nobody else is. They've got their other agendas. There are other reasons for being in the mix there. But so they're not worried so much, other than they've got a marketplace they want to sell to, presumably, and depending on what they are. But they've got to appeal to that. But governments are worried about being elected. And so that does, by virtue of our election cycle, shorten our horizon in terms of our these policy decisions and direction of our planning laws, really.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
And here we are, and we have a crisis, and we're talking about it, because that's basically what this all is, a giant talk fest. We're not doing anything constructive about it, are we? At the end of the day, and there's lots and lots of hot air about it. We have been talking about this and as an issue for some time, actually, even before COVID. Homelessness and the unfairness and the gap widening, all those sort of things. These are issues that we've been talking about for a long time. What is it going to take for some positive action here? I mentioned earlier in the intro that this is a crisis that, unless you are personally impacted by it, unless you're the boomer in the comfy suburb and your kid can't buy a home, all of a sudden, then it affects you. But until it affects you like that, you just think, I don't understand what the problem is. So how are we ever going to get to the point where there's a tipping point where actually we're going to do something now,
Yeah. Well, so, I think there's a couple of thoughts. I think we have a government right now that is actually the state government, the New South Wales government, that is positive on this, right? They say they want to do something about that. I think that's really good because, there was a lot of good things the last government did under Berejiklian and Perrottet and O'Farrell. But one area where I think they categorically did not deliver was on housing. It's pretty clear that they didn't care that much about low income people. They didn't really increase or invest in social housing and the like. So there's gaps there, right? So I think that's really positive. We've got a government that wants to do this, but it's also important for us to remember that this is not going to be solved overnight. And so, even if we get to the end of this 4-year electoral cycle and we're going to vote, regardless of how good a job they do, house prices are still going to be expensive in Sydney. So if we judge them purely off that, there's no way they're going to be able to solve for that. So we got to remember that.
I'd be disappointed if they weren't, because I'm a homeowner.
Yeah.
But I do want people to all have a home.
Well, that's very good of you.
I'm
conflicted good on
too.
You. Good on you.
See? Yeah. But this is the fact of it. Let's get this out there. As soon as you're in the property market, you don't want prices to fall, but you do want other people to have an opportunity to get in. You do want people to be able to afford your rent. You know what I mean? So it's like, how do we actually balance all this stuff out?
Well, this is where these alternative types of housing come in to play, right? It doesn't have to affect your property values for us to build a bunch of social housing. It doesn't have to affect your property values for build to rent to be invested in, because they're not being priced against you and there's no sort of market that you're competing in that space, right? Because this is one of the challenges is when we talk about, we want to increase supply because that'll reduce prices, but we don't actually want lower prices because we've embedded a lot of national wealth in house prices, right?
Yes,
so this is why saying, well, all right, well, if the outcome we want is lots of housing and we don't really want to mess with prices too much, well, then let's build a bunch of houses that don't affect price. That's the trick with this. It's build all this other housing that delivers homes for people, that give them a secure, good life in a good place, but don't have to sort of fundamentally affect people's ability to retire.
But you also need to get the people to do it rather than the government, right? I mean, you said that the last government, for example, didn't invest in housing policies for, social housing, et cetera, but they did go on a massive infrastructure boom, right? And spending, right? So the debt that we've created then, can we just rely on the government to solve these issues, or do we need to then just let the market solve these issues by making incentives to them, right? Encouraging developers and cutting taxes and, zoning and so it's almost like, well, we can't solve this, but we can make it much easier for you to make this profitable, and we'll give you the right tools and the and the story, because I think you're right. The stories, if we say, look, this is big picture Sydney over the next 10 years, this is what we're doing. We're not backing down, bipartisan agreement on that. And we're going to, and is it that long-term vision that I just don't think's there, right? Like, you've got this, like Sydney needs to go up to build more housing. That's been in the news for the last month, right? But is it more than that, right? Sydney needs to go up. Sydney needs to go out. Sydney needs to go, mega Sydney. Do we go to Newcastle to Wollongong? Like, there's lots of solutions here, but there's no real overarching housing rental affordability plan that, that we're running off.
Yeah. Oh, look, you're right. I mean, government has no money, right? So they're not going to be building the housing. Their role will be to create the enabling environment for the private sector to deliver this housing. That the cheapest and biggest lever they have is zoning. They could just say all these places, all these sites, you can put an extra 5 stories on it, and whiz bang wow, all of a sudden feasibility is like totally amazing, and a bunch of property developers will absolutely be able to find capital and talent to build those houses, right? Because that was free. That didn't cost government anything to do that rezoning, other than definitely some political capital, because the neighbours will hate it. But like from a budget bottom line, right? That's free. So the role that government will play will be as an enabler, not as a deliverer in and of themselves. And I mean, unless we're then getting into the conversation about building high-speed rail up to Newcastle and down to Wollongong, which I love. That's when you mentioned the Sandstone mega region at the beginning. That's our vision for the Sandstone mega region, is the Newcastle, Central Coast, Sydney, Wollongong mega region. But you need a lot of government money to build that high-speed rail line. So that would be where I'd want them to be putting their money.
I'm glad you reminded us of that, because I did mention that and I thought, wanted to know what that was. So that's the Sandstone mega region, is basically defined by our basin, i.e. the rock that we're all sitting on at the moment.
It's the sandstone,
right?
exactly that. Yeah, exactly.
The problem with that is that, Newcastle's Central Coast is water everywhere, right? And national parks. So you're going to either, take a natural wildlife hit, right? Like, to convert that. So there's not much more housing, I reckon, there. Like, it's a bit more, right? And then Newcastle, where people really want to be, Newcastle's also around sort of Merriweather and Newcastle Beach. And then you've got like Stockton on the other side of the water, and it's quite landlocked. And then Wollongong, right? You've got the massive escarpment, and, then you've got this, Albion Park region but you'd have to build the train right all the way down there. So, it's not like we've got like 3 Melbournes, right? We're just these big flat, vast land that we could build out. Do you reckon that's going to be one of our issues, is that even when you add that train in, like, we're going to have very quickly, those areas will be running out of housing anyway.
Well, let's first thing, Sydney's geographic size is about the same as Tokyo's, and Tokyo's got 25 million people. So like space is something in our existing kind of frame of what housing space looks like is a problem for Sydney, but it's not an actual problem. It's just a conceptual one. I reckon we can get 1 million people into Wollongong and 1 million people into Newcastle. There's my bold prediction, because look, yes, Albion Park, yes, Port Kembla, yes, Dapto aren't amazing places right now, but density brings amenity. Like, you will turn Dapto, you will turn Port Kembla into incredible, vibrant centres where people won't be commuting up to Sydney. They'll be commuting to Port Kembla to work at the port, because there'll be amazing jobs there. When you bring the people, it's like this self sort of, fulfilling cycle of sort of people bring money, bring amenity, bring people kind of thing. So look, I'm not too worried about the fact that like we've got weird geography. I mean, yeah, we do, but that geography also makes this a beautiful landscape. And like we're actually like, we can give ourselves the credit that we actually can come up with pretty novel solutions to solve for some of that stuff.
Yep. So Eamon, have you got a property dumbo for us to wrap us up?
Yeah. So when I was going to auction to buy my first house, and I didn't get this house, but it was a beautiful apartment in Marrickville, 5 minutes walk from the train station. Geez, I wish, not a day goes past when I don't think about that apartment and how great my life would have been if I'd lived there. and I was in the auction. I was bidding in the auction, and this will give you a sign of quite how long ago it was. You know, the price had got to $550,000, and that was my limit. And I was up against, it was me and one other couple bidding, and they had a buyer's agent. And the buyer's agent was wearing his, you know, aviators, so you couldn't see his face. He had his arms crossed across his face. You know, he was the absolute image of stoic kind of, you know, professionalism. And I was absolutely, you know, crapping my dacks as a sort of young guy, sort of like trying to get my first house. And, you know, we were going up by $10,000 increments, and then $5,000 increments, and then $1,000 increments. And I was like, I went to 554,000. So I was a bit over my limit, but, you know, $4,000, like I would have survived. And then the buyer's agent turned to me, because he went one more thousand, he went 555. He turns to me and goes, mate, I got nothing but time. I could do this all day. And it just destroyed me psychologically. And I was like, nah, I'm out. That's it. I couldn't possibly compete with that. This guy can go all day and I can't. And of course he wins the bid, or that couple wins the bid, and they get the house. And then I like immediately afterwards had a reflection. I was like, hang on a minute. No, he couldn't. He was bidding by 1,000 increments as well. Like, he couldn't go all day. He was definitely over his limit, and he psyched me out because I sort of like, I got tied up in the moment. So I guess the Dumbo thing is like, auctions are designed to put you in this high pressure situation. But sometimes like you need to take a step back and just breathe and be like, hang on a minute, what is the actual circumstance of this negotiation that I'm in, and actually what's going on? Because probably if I'd gone an extra couple more thousand, I would have got the house, because he was saying that because he was equally crapping his dacks, but he was, you know, a professional who knew how to make that sound fancy instead of, you know, scared.
I love that story. Mainly, I've written a book on auction. No, I kid
Oh,
you not.
really?
It's called Auction Ready. I
Why
love
didn't I
auctions.
read that? Why didn't I read that?
I don't know why. Maybe I hadn't written it then. I actually finished it and launched it in February 2020, just when we got shut down. Great timing. But I find auctions fascinating. Anyone who's listened to enough of these episodes will know. And I've just actually, funnily enough, while we've been talking, I don't know why, this is a thought that crept in the back of my head. We're long overdue to interview another auctioneer. We do like to interview auctioneers every now and then and get sort of lift the bonnet and look under the hood. But I was talking to my partner the other day about training up buyer's agents to bid at auction, right? Because, you know, everybody's got their first auction. So as a buyer, you know, quite often a buyer, the first auction they go to is the one they're bidding at. Now, that honestly, the thing you can do to counteract that is to go and observe auctions.
100%.
But as buyer's agents, I see buyer's agents who are inexperienced bidding for their clients, and they wouldn't be doing that, right? Because that guy has been around the tracks. He read your body language. I can put money on it. He's worked out you're a bit over your limit. He's just wanting to shut you down, and that's his bit of dialogue, and he did it. He did it well, right? Every buyer's agent should have a limit. You know, they should be instructed by the client, should have a limit, you know, so they don't have bottomless pockets, although I like to let people think I do as well. But also, you know, I was talking about this with my partner, and she said, it's like Eddie the Eagle, right? So for the first time you go and bid at an auction, it's like Eddie the Eagle, you know, at the top of that mountain, about to ski down and then fly up that jump. It's like you the minute you go, you're in it. You know, you don't have time to second think, oh shit, I haven't practiced this, or I hadn't thought about that. You're committed, and you have to pick your angle, pick everything, and all the practice that you've done in your head and little jumps and that sort of stuff. It all sort of comes to the fore. And yeah, once the auction starts, you know, you don't get the chance to, in the middle afterwards, to go back and, oh yeah, I could do that differently next time and improve. It's a one-off. You know, if you crash after jumping off that jump, you're done for. And that's such an interesting story. I'm sorry you didn't get it, you know, because I would have loved to.
It's all right. I got another place, which was lovely as well. But yeah, look, I wish I had been a bit more, you're so right. Like, you go into this stuff and it is one of the biggest decisions you make in your life, right? Buying a house, and you're so underprepared for it. And then when you think you're finally prepared for it, you get a house, and then you're like, well, I won't use any of that information again for the next 5 years, sort of thing. Like, it's this crazy roller coaster.
Actually, even worse, in 5 years or whatever time, you go, right, well, I'm going to use all that information. They don't realize that it doesn't apply because every situation's different.
Totally.
Anyway, it's been a great chat. Really appreciate you coming along, Eamon. And look, you know, as I said, we do talk a lot. We talk a lot about this sort of stuff here. I'd like to see more action, you know, from those who are in positions where they can take action, because this crisis it's absolutely horrific. And I am horrified in the sense that we are a first world country and this is happening here. And I just think it's terrible. You know, that doesn't help anybody who's in that situation, me thinking it's terrible, but we just got to get action. And so if this little humble podcast can convince someone in some some corridor of power to, oh, come on, get around, do something, then we've done our job.
Thanks so much, Eamon. Thanks for coming
Thanks
on.
for having me, team. Appreciate it.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.